This type of behavior may have kept you safe as a child, may have made your relationships less confrontational and less full of conflict, and may have made you feel more loved. But now you're an adult, and those same tendencies, those same narratives have become really hard to untangle, and instead of being beneficial, they are actually wreaking havoc on your own mental health. Today we're talking about people-pleasing. We are going to talk about why people-pleasing comes up, what sort of childhood experiences may trigger this type of behavior, and some really subtle ways that this can show up in our day-to-day behavior. Because it's not always as obvious as you may think. Some of the ways that these tendencies and this kind of trauma response shows up can be a lot more subtle than you think. Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Mindset Gym podcast, where we exercise your way of thinking to help unlock your hidden potential. I'm your host, Emily Irwin, a registered nurse and holistic nutritionist with a passion for all things health, fitness, and personal development. All right, let's get into it.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Mindset Gym podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We are diving into people-pleasing today. This is a learned behavior, something that can typically pop up in adulthood as a result of childhood experiences. But there's a lot of really subtle ways that this can show up in your day-to-day behavior, and so today I want to dive into some of the not so obvious ways that this can show up in our day-to-day behavior and talk through some strategies to help overcome this. This is kind of a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I think of all the kind of personal development, self-improvement kind of umbrella themes, this is probably one that I struggle with the most. This is an experience that I feel kind of closely relates to my experience. I think a lot of the things that I will be talking about today, some of the subtle ways that this shows up, are things that I have done and things that I have experienced. And so I'm actually really excited to dive into this topic and kind of unpack it a little bit because I think sometimes we are engaging in a lot of people-pleasing behavior that we don't actually realize is people-pleasing behavior. We don't actually realize that we are playing out a narrative that we picked up when we were children that is actually no longer serving us. So I'm going to start off by explaining what exactly people-pleasing is, because at face value, you may think it's just, being nice and being helpful and wanting to be there to support others. Those are all really great things. Those are all really good traits. And that's not exactly what this is. It is that, but it's that tied to something else. So people-pleasing is you not just being nice to other people. It's not just you helping other people. It's not just you wanting to be supportive of other people. It's you putting other people's wants and needs higher on the priority list than your own, and abandoning your own mental well-being and abandoning your own wants and needs in order to serve the other person. So this is kind of the differentiating factor. You being nice and you being helpful and you wanting to help other people out, that's a good thing. Those are good things. But if you are doing it at the cost of your own well-being, this is when we're dipping into people-pleasing behavior and we are suddenly doing something that is not solely helpful for other people. It is actually detrimental to ourselves. So why can this behavior come up in the first place? What kind of experiences may foster this type of behavior in adulthood? So when we think back to being a child, the most important things to us is the love and relationship we have with our parents. And that's what we understand, that's what we operate on, that's what we determine our behavior around. And so we want to act in a way that is going to make us feel loved, that is going to make us feel safe, and that is going to foster connection between us and the people that are taking care of us. So some things that can trigger people-pleasing behavior. Number one is unpredictable caregivers. So if you have people who are taking care of you, parents, caregivers, grandparents, whoever it was, who had really unpredictable moods, and it was really hard to gauge what version of them you were going to get at what time, it creates this scenario where you become very hyper-vigilant of their moods and very aware of any subtle changes. And you begin almost walking on eggshells because you don't want to do anything that is going to kind of trip that switch and flip them into a really bad mood. So you very much edit your behavior in order to keep the peace. Something else that can trigger this type of behavior is if you had a caregiver whose love and affection was conditional. So if you had someone who only expressed love to you, only was interested in having a relationship with you if you were doing certain things, whether it's doing things for them, helping them out in some sort of way, or achieving certain things. So this could look like the person who is really high achieving in school and is getting really good grades and is doing all the things because this is the only way that they get any sort of recognition from their parents. And so they are constantly kind of running on empty and burning the candle at both ends in order to achieve and achieve and achieve in order to get any sort of recognition. So any situation where that kind of love and affection and feelings of being safe was conditional on how you behaved can lead to this type of people-pleasing behavior in the future. The next thing that can lead to people-pleasing behavior is if you grew up in a really conflict-heavy household. So if you were in a situation where there was a lot of conflict and fighting going on a regular basis, the child may take on the role of peacemaker, quote unquote. And so you edit your behavior in order to try and avoid conflict. You try not to, poke the bear, so to say. You don't want to do anything that's going to create any sort of added conflict, so you do everything in your power to try and keep the peace. Something else that can lead to this is a term called parentification, and this is where children are placed in kind of an adult role. They are given responsibilities and roles and demands that are not necessarily appropriate for children. And so you take on kind of a caregiver, parenting type role as a child, which subconsciously will create this narrative that you need to put your own needs and wants second in order to care for this other person. And this becomes the narrative that you kind of operate on. There are some other situations that can create people-pleasing tendencies, and these can include overly strict or authoritarian type parenting, where kids will maybe suppress their own wants and feelings in order to avoid punishment or scrutiny from their parents. People who experience neglect from their caregivers, people who experienced a lot of bullying when they were growing up. Someone who maybe had a really difficult sibling may take on the role of being the easy child in order to try and facilitate the experience for their parents. So there is a whole sea of experiences that people can have growing up that is going to create a type of narrative that leads to people-pleasing behavior. And you may be hearing the examples of these, and you may relate to one of them. You may relate to many of them. There may be kind of this intermingled mix of experiences that I've just listed off that has created a scenario where you are operating on this narrative. I have talked a little bit about this in a previous episode as well, because the older I get, realize that I struggle with this type of behavior. And so I've really been trying to pick apart why and pick apart what that kind of underlying narrative is that is driving that behavior. What is it that is running on loop in the background in my head that is driving these behaviors that aren't necessarily serving me? And I mentioned this a couple episodes back, that something I've kind of identified is that I have subconsciously tied my self-worth as a person to what I can do for others, and tied my value in any sort of relationship. So if I have a relationship with someone else, I kind of deem my value and my worth in that relationship based on the things that I'm doing for the other person. And if I try to set boundaries and try to take a step back and protect my own peace in any sort of way, I'm kind of hit with this immense amount of guilt that I no longer bring value to the table, and this fear that the other person will no longer want to have the relationship because I don't bring value to the table. Even though that's not true. And so this is kind of the narrative that I have been able to piece together that has driven some of my own behavior. And reflecting on it and thinking about the ways that I have operated because of that narrative in various relationships made me kind of start thinking about the more subtle ways that this behavior can pop up, because there were things that I was doing over the course of my life that when I was in the thick of it, didn't register with me that I was people pleasing. It didn't register with me that what I was doing was a response to a narrative that I created years and years ago. So we're going to dive into some of these really unconventional ways that this type of behavior pops up, because you might be doing some of these as well. The first one I want to talk about is being the quote unquote low maintenance partner. This is something I was immensely guilty of, especially in my younger years when I was first getting into dating and I was first getting into relationships. I used to pride myself in a way on being the low maintenance partner, on being the partner who never needed anything, the one who never complained, the one who never caused a problem when my partner was doing something that I didn't agree with. And at the time, I used it as like a badge of honor. I remember I would compare myself to other girlfriends and relationships and think, oh, well, look at them asking so much of their partner. Look at them causing all this conflict. Look at me being so easygoing and so low maintenance. This is what makes me such a good partner, is I'm so low maintenance and I don't need anything. And I prided myself on that. And I'm sure some of you are listening to that and thinking, I've done the same thing. And you pride yourself on being this person who doesn't need anything and this person who's just so easy breezy and super chill and doesn't complain and anything like that. When in reality, you have wants, you have needs. There's been things that have happened that you're not totally okay with. There's boundaries that you were wanting to set. There's conversations that you were wanting to have. But you push them down and you shove them away in order to remain this kind of low maintenance partner. And so you're not really the low maintenance partner that you pride yourself on being. You are someone who is abandoning their own needs in order to protect the peace in the relationship. So if that sounds like you, I want you to start reflecting on relationships where you have done this, especially romantic ones. If you are kind of pigeonholing yourself as this low maintenance person who doesn't need anything, really take the time to think about that and think about whether or not there have been wants or needs or conversations that you have kind of swallowed and shoved aside in order to keep the peace. There's nothing wrong with you being a little bit higher maintenance than you are if it means protecting your own well-being. The next way that this can show up is over-explaining, giving long-winded over-justifications for your decisions. So let's say, for example, somebody tries to make plans with you and you don't want to, or you're busy and you have to tell them no for some reason. And you feel the need to explain and explain and explain and justify the decision that you've made, when in reality, you just saying no was fine. You didn't need to give this long-winded explanation. You do not need to justify all of your decisions to somebody else. You're allowed to just make a decision because that's the best decision for you, and that is that. The next way this can show up is softening your opinions or pretending like you don't have opinions. So let's say you and someone else are trying to decide on what to do for the evening, where to go for dinner, what kind of plans to make, where you want to go. And you find yourself saying, I'm cool with whatever. I don't really care. When in reality, you do care. You do have an opinion on that topic. But you're afraid that if you share it, it's not going to be what the other person wants to do, and you're going to let them down. And this can almost create a scenario where you having to make decisions becomes paralyzing, because that fear of letting someone else down, that fear of making the quote unquote wrong decision feels so detrimental that you can't even get the words out when it comes to making a decision. And I'll give you a really simple example of how this shows up in my own life, at least. So let's say me and my fiance are trying to decide where we want to go for dinner. There have been times where I have had an opinion on where I want to go, and I get so caught up in my head that what I'm going to suggest is going to be not the thing that he wants. And so I can't even get the words out. I can't even express my opinion. So instead I'll say something like, whatever you want. What do you want to do? What would you prefer? When in reality, I did have an opinion on the topic, but you almost can't get the words out. And so this can be a hard one to untangle, but it can also be something that you can work on really slowly. Start small. let's go back to the dinner example. If you and someone else are trying to figure out where you want to go for dinner, if it's too scary for you to start off right off the bat and say, I want to go here, pick a genre of food. I would like to eat at this type of place and go from there and kind of make it a collaborative process, but start to share a little bit of your own opinions. You are not going to let someone else down by expressing your opinion. And something I like to do is kind of flip the script to reframe this for myself. So if I'm in a situation like this where I'm afraid to express my opinion on what I want to do with somebody else, I try to imagine what I would feel like if they expressed their opinion to me. And I'm not picking apart what they want to do. I'm not sitting here criticizing it. Chances are, if they tell me what they want to do, that's great. I'm just happy that they've shared their opinion and I'm excited to see what it's about, right? And it takes a little bit of the pressure off imagining it in the reverse with the other person giving you their opinion on something, because it makes you realize it's really not as scary and not as high stakes as you're making it out to be. You're allowed to share your opinions. The next subtle way that this can show up is hyper-vigilance around people's moods and behaviors. And this can look like picking up on every subtle little facial expression, every little movement, every little change in behavior, and trying to extrapolate how that person is feeling based on every subtle move they make and every little change in their facial expression. And this can create a crap ton of anxiety because you spend this ridiculous amount of time trying to overanalyze and understand every little tiny behavior change that is happening in another person. When in reality, you can't read their mind. You don't really know what's going on, and so you're making decisions based on behaviors of maybe people you grew up with. You're making inferences about how this person feels based on narratives that you formed years ago. And you create all this anxiety that, I think this person's mad at me, or I think this person's upset, or I think there is an impending conflict, when that may not necessarily be the case. And this can show up in really funny ways. So I'll give you a couple examples from my own life of how this has shown up in really silly, subtle ways. So when I was a kid, we lived in kind of an older house, and when anybody would come up the stairs to come to the second floor, the stairs would creak. And I used to be very hyper aware of the sounds it made when one of my parents was coming up the stairs in a good mood or when they were stomping up the stairs in a bad mood. And I got very good at kind of differentiating. I could tell what kind of mood any particular person was going to be in based on how I heard them coming up the stairs. And I was always very hyper vigilant of this. And so anytime I would hear somebody coming up the stairs, I would kind of stop what I'm doing and listen. And I could kind of infer what to expect based on that. And as an adult, this is manifested in a funny way because now I live with my fiance, and if I am upstairs alone and I hear him coming up the stairs, I am overcome with this kind of panic, and I stop what I'm doing. If I have the TV on, I pause it. If I have music on, I pause it, and I freeze and listen and try to hear him coming up the stairs, and I start getting all this anxiety about it, which is just a really funny way that this pops up because I don't need to be analyzing the way he comes up the stairs, right? I don't need to be making inferences on how he feels. If he's feeling a certain way, he'll tell me. I don't need to be sitting here ruminating over how he walked up the stairs. But I do. And it's kind of this funny way that it shows up. Another way that this shows up is anytime I hear somebody sigh out of nowhere. So if somebody is doing something and they do anything like that. And people don't always necessarily do that because they're angry. Sometimes people do that to, try and take stress off. Sometimes people do it because they're relieved. Some people just do it without even realizing it. And anytime I hear somebody do it, there's this little pang of anxiety, and I can feel my heart start to race because I'm expecting conflict. But that's not necessarily coming. And so these are just kind of some funny ways that you may notice you're getting anxious over little behaviors because they're tied to an old narrative that you used to have. The next subtle way that this can show up, and this kind of goes hand in hand with some of the previous ones that I talked about, so being the low maintenance partner, being hyper vigilant of other people's behavior changes, and this is avoiding conflict at all costs. And so you will go out of your way to avoid stirring up any sort of conflict, to avoid kind of starting any sort of argument or fight with another person. And the way that you often do this is by silencing your opinions completely. So doing things like voicing an opinion, doing things like setting boundaries, doing things like saying no, doing things that you think may let somebody down or make somebody sad or mad or disappointed. You avoid doing them altogether because you do not want to create any sort of conflict, because it feels like kind of this worst case scenario. It feels like this thing that needs to be avoided at all costs. And the discomfort of you doing what is right for you and sitting in that conflict feels worse than you abandoning your own needs and just swallowing it and not doing anything about it at all. And so the thing I want you to keep in mind, if this is how this is showing up for you and this is something that you struggle to overcome, is that your narrative around conflict and how bad that conflict is going to be is often very disproportionate to what it is actually going to be like. And the reality of it is the kind of internal turmoil and conflict that you create by swallowing your own opinions and swallowing the things that you want to say in order to avoid conflict with somebody else creates so much more conflict within yourself than you will ever experience by just having that conversation with another person. I have seen this kind of play out several times in my own life where there have been circumstances where I wanted to voice an opinion, or I wanted to tell somebody no, or I wanted to set a boundary, and I would get so nervous and so caught up in my head about what that kind of fallout and conflict was going to look like after the fact. And there has never been a time that conflict has ended up matching the severity of what I think it's going to be in my head. It is never as bad as I think it's going to be. And this is kind of a really helpful thing. This is something that I continue to learn and continue to try and unpack every time that I step out of that comfort zone and set boundaries with people and voice my opinions, is realizing and understanding that fallout with the other person is never as bad as I expect it to be. And I end up realizing after the fact that the kind of internal conflict I was dealing with was worse than the external conflict ended up being. So if you are avoiding conflict at all costs, chances are you're creating more conflict within yourself, and you doing that thing that you're very scared to do is not going to be as bad as it seems like it's going to be in your head. Another subtle way that this can pop up is mirroring. This is a type of behavior in which, in order to be more likable, or to try and be more likable, you mirror the behavior of the person you're talking to. So you may take on their mannerisms, you may unintentionally take on their interests and the way that they talk, and you shift your personality just a little slightly, depending on who you're around, in order to try and be more likable, in order to try and kind of connect with this other person more. You get so focused on having the other person like you and creating a relationship with the person that you abandon your own identity in a little bit of a way. And the funny thing about this is that the deepest, most wholehearted connections you will ever create don't come from you mirroring other people and trying to be likable. They come from you being authentic and you sharing who you truly are. And it can feel really scary to do this because there's that fear of abandonment. There's that fear that someone may not like you for who you truly are. But the reality is, not everybody in this world needs to like you. And if you show up as your true, authentic self, the people who are meant to be around you, the people who you are meant to have relationships with, they will like you just for who you are, not for some version of yourself that you're trying to be. Last and probably most common way that this type of people-pleasing behavior can show up is overcommitting. Saying yes when you want to say no. This can look like a whole lot of things. This can look like taking on too many tasks at work because you're afraid to tell your boss that you can't do it. This can look like overcommitting to plans that you don't want to do because you're afraid to tell anybody no. This can look like taking on a lot more responsibility for someone else that you don't really want to take on because you're afraid to let them down. And you end up putting your own needs and your own well-being aside in order to help serve what this other person needs. And what that other person needs ends up becoming the top priority, which means anything that has to do with you gets bumped down the priority list. And this is kind of the heart of that people-pleasing behavior. This is kind of the most common way that we see this manifest, is you constantly taking on the needs of other people and taking on too much stuff and not taking a second to think about what is best for you and operating with your own best interests in mind. So this can be a hard one. This can be a really hard one to overcome. So I'm going to discuss some kind of simple strategies to help you start to approach this. The first one that I want you to do is to start practicing deferring your answer. Let me explain what this looks like. So let's say someone asks if you're free next week to hang out, and you're not sure if you want to, or you're not sure if you're even available to. And normally your instinct would just be to be like, oh yeah, it'll work, that's totally fine. And you just commit to it without actually giving it a whole lot of thought. Instead of saying no right away, say something like, let me get back to you. Let me check with so-and-so. Let me check my schedule. And create some way to defer your answer so that you can then take the time to consider what's being asked of you, consider what is best for you, consider if this is something that you really want to take on or whether or not you're capable of taking it on in the first place. And then you can kind of piece together the way in which you want to approach that with the other person, whether you want to tell them yes or whether you want to tell them no. This just gives you that kind of buffer time to really sit in it and really consider it and make an informed decision instead of just panicking and saying yes. So you don't need to say no right away. You don't need to do the scary thing right out of the gate. Just defer your answer. Just start saying some variation of, let me get back to you. And then take some time and figure out what the best decision is for you. The second thing that I want you to keep in mind in order to try and help overcome this type of behavior is you need to remember that you have value. You are worthy as a person just for being you. You do not need to do a certain number of things on a to-do list. You do not need to accomplish a certain amount of tasks at work. You do not need to commit to every single thing that is being asked of you in order to be worthy as a person. You are worthy and you are valuable on your own. And if you have relationships that fall apart as a result of you setting boundaries and expressing your opinions, those relationships were not meant for you in the first place. You do not need to abandon your own wants and needs in order to try and keep every single person happy and around. The right relationships will stay, and the right people will understand when you need to set boundaries. The third thing I want you to do under this kind of similar umbrella is I want you to be aware of how you agreeing to do something makes you feel. So let's say we're in a place where you are not quite ready to take that leap and start setting boundaries and start saying no, and you're still taking on more than you can or more than you should be. The first thing I want you to do is I just want you to take some time and sit and reflect on how that decision makes you feel. Even if you don't necessarily go back and suddenly tell them no or set the boundary right away, just having that awareness piece of like, oh, I've overcommitted to these things and now I feel really overwhelmed. Now I feel really stressed. Now I feel really burnt out. Or I can see how me agreeing to do this certain thing is impacting my mental health in such and such ways. Having that awareness is the first step to you being able to make change. So even if you don't do anything right away, just take some time to reflect on how you're actually feeling about the decisions that you've made. The last thing that I want you to do, kind of under the same subject, is that if you have to have a tough conversation with someone, if you have to set a boundary with someone, if you have to express an opinion, if you have to go and tell somebody no to something that they're asking you to do, prepare for that conversation whenever possible. Don't just go into it blind and hope for the best and say, okay, I'm going to set a boundary and that'll be that. Because chances are when you go and have these conversations, especially early on, it is going to stir up a lot of emotion in you. It is going to be a really difficult conversation to get through, not just because of, how the other person may feel, not just because of that immediate dynamic, but because of this narrative that is going on in the background that you are actively trying to untangle because of all of these emotions from your past that are feeding into it. And if you go into some of these conversations blind and you just expect to wing it, there's going to be a lot of emotion that comes up, and it's going to be really difficult to get your point across in the way that you want to. So whenever you can, whenever you have the chance to do so, prepare for these conversations and really think out the ways in which you want to articulate what you're trying to say. It'll make it a little bit easier to go into that situation and express yourself in the ways that you're wanting to. So that's what I have for you today. I just want you to mull some of these things over because people-pleasing tendencies, I think, is a very common thing that I think a lot of us struggle with because there's so many complex experiences that can happen to us that kind of create some variation of this narrative. And being aware of all the subtle ways in which it pops up can be really helpful in us starting to untangle that narrative. It's not your job to please everybody. It's not your job to abandon your needs to make everyone else's life easier. It's not your job to keep the peace. It's not your job to avoid any sort of conflict from ever happening in your life. It's not your job to be liked by everybody. And you do not need to prove your value by doing a million things for everybody else. You are valuable and you are worthy just the way you are. All right? Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next week.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show. If you like the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, or share the show with a friend. Your support helps the show reach even more incredible people just like you. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time at the Mindset Gym.